The First Tiberium War. After an extraterrestrial meteor lands in the Tiber River in 1995, a new resource races on for the green crystal known as Tiberium. Named, of course, for the river where it was first found.
Discovered by the Brotherhood, that is, and I named it after Tiberius Drusus Caesar.
Okay, Kane, my mistake. Now, sometime after, the quasi-nation-state, religious movement, and economic powerhouse known as the Brotherhood of Nod takes control of almost half the world's known supply of Tiberium. The crystal has incredible properties, mainly being able to leach precious minerals from deep beneath the earth for easy harvesting at a minimum of mining expense. But as Dr. Mobius once said,
"The possibilities of Tiberium are limitless."
Combined with a growing influence of Nod in various political movements in both the Third World and Western nations, as well as numerous terrorist attacks ever increasing in frequency, the United Nations grows worried. After Nod begins mobilizing armed forces in major military campaigns in Eastern Europe and Africa, the UN grants permission for the Global Defense Initiative to take action. The military arm of the United Nations, GDI is given nearly independent jurisdiction to prosecute war against the Brotherhood of Nod until it is no longer a threat to the free world. And I was so ready to begin working on a video essay that would be the most in-depth coverage of the First Tiberium War I could manage. But there's just one little lore controversy that keeps rearing its head in all of my research. Other than the 1995 date for when the Tiberium meteor landed on Earth, there are no dates given for the rest of the war. The next concrete year given in the Tiberium Games is in the 1999 Tiberian Sun Manual, placing the Second Tiberium War definitively in the year 2030. Now, this has led to some debate on when exactly between 1995 and 2030 the First Tiberium War actually takes place. For most of the series' history, the community has tacitly agreed that it takes place sometime in the late 1990s, maybe spilling over into the early 2000s. But another viewpoint has emerged in recent years, bolstered by the fact that the year 2020 shows up in the 2002 game Command & Conquer Renegade. So, which is it? The late 1990s?
This is the 1990s.
Or somewhere around 2020. Given that the only concrete year ever given in the Tiberium series is the 2020 year in the Renegade Manual, it would seem that this is definitive proof that the First Tiberium War started far later than the community had ever thought. But look, I'm not going to bury the lead. I think that the 2020 date for the First Tiberium War is total bull. Okay, for the 1990s camp, we have 5 major pieces of evidence. All sources will be cited on screen and placed in the description for you to look at yourself. First up, in an FAQ dating back to 1998, one Brett Sperry is interviewed. For those of you who don't know, Brett Sperry was the co-founder and president of Westwood Studios, the original creators of Command & Conquer. In addition, he crafted a lot of the overarching story for the Tiberium universe, and was the one who convinced the team to shift from a fantasy RTS to one focused more on a modern near-future conflict. The interview we're looking at now, having taken place in 1998, would be after the release of the original Command & Conquer and the first Red Alert, as well as the ill-fated multiplayer-only Sole Survivor, but crucially before Tiberian Sun would be released in 1999. Here, the interviewer is asking Brett Sperry about the upcoming Tiberian Sun. When asked what has happened since the other games in the Command & Conquer series lore-wise, Sperry answers that the first Red Alert took place in the latter half of the 20th century, and is truly the start of the Tiberian struggle. As for the first Command & Conquer, retroactively renamed Tiberian Dawn, Sperry states that it took place in the, quote, last part of the 20th century, unquote. By contrast, he claims that Tiberian Sun, quote, moves forward into the 21st century, unquote. So, at least a year before Tiberian Sun released, and 4 years before the release of Renegade in 2002, it seems that the internal lore at Westwood was that the First Tiberium War indeed took place in the late 1990s. This interview even seems to shoot down the possibility that the First Tiberian War spilled over into the 2000s, but I suppose that's open to interpretation. Next up, our second piece of evidence, the October 1999 issue of PC Gamer magazine. Now, side note, but if you can manage to get a hold of a digital copy of the issue like I did, boy, is this a blast from the past. Age of Empires 2, Halo Combat Evolved, Army Men Toys in Space, Half-Life Opposing Force, and The Sims? It's crazy to see these old games talked about as highly anticipated upcoming releases. Anyway, the kicker is that this issue features a lengthy interview with Lewis Castle, another co-founder of Westwood Studios, as well as a programmer for Tiberian Dawn, Red Alert 1, and Tiberian Sun. Crucially, he also served as executive producer and additional designer for Command & Conquer Renegade. As stated, this interview takes place in October of 1999, a little over a month since Tiberian Sun released and 3 years prior to Renegade releasing. On page 74, Lewis Castle discusses the link Renegade's story has with Tiberian Sun's. Renegade's storyline is set towards the end of the original Command & Conquer, as the evil Brotherhood of Nod kidnaps the mysterious Dr. Mobius in an attempt to harness the mutative power of Tiberium to create an army of super soldiers. Here, Castle states, quote, "In Tiberian Sun, you'll see the ultimate results of that, which is the Nod Commando Cyborg unit. In Renegade, your whole objective is to stop those experiments from happening, or at least delay them. The story for our real-time strategy games presumes that you're successful, because it took the Nod some 30-odd years to regain the technology that they basically had at the finish of the original CNC." Unquote. The Nod. So at least by 1999, the executive producer and additional designer for Command & Conquer Renegade claimed that the First Tiberian War took place about 30 years prior to the events of Tiberian Sun, which we know took place definitively in 2030. So far, it seems that the leadership of Westwood is agreed upon the vision that the First Tiberian War took place in the late 1990s. And importantly, this includes leadership that were directly involved with the creation of Renegade. Now, this is good for the late 1990s camp, but it's not definitive yet. After all, this article also states that the main playable character of Renegade will be the son of General Shepard from Tiberian Dawn. And as we all know, by the time the game was released, the main character was changed to being Nick Havoc Parker. So, things may have still changed between 1999 and 2002 when the game was finally released. Let's keep going. Next on the docket, we have a Gamma Sutra article by Raid
Stoysavljevic
giving a post-mortem on Tiberian Sun. This article dates back to April 4th, 2000, just a few months before Red Alert 2 releases, 1 year after Tiberian Sun releases, and 2 years before Renegade releases. Raid
Stoysavljevic
was a Westwood producer on several early CNC titles, including Tiberian Sun and Firestorm, and even consulted on Command & Conquer General 0 Hour. He also wrote the manual for Tiberian Sun. In the article, Raid writes, quote, "Another nice benefit of making a sequel is that we had a set of basic features we knew worked based on previous games. These provided a solid foundation that could be expanded upon and modified as needed. We started with features from the previous games that we knew we wanted and updated them to fit a world that was 30 years in the future. Tanks evolved into two-legged mechanized walkers. Soldiers can now use drop pods launched from space, and cloaking technology advanced to yield a stealth generator that hid many units and buildings at once." Unquote. So, now we have by at least the year 2000, 2 years prior to the release of Renegade, a major producer at Westwood is claiming that the vision by the team is that the First Tiberian War took place in the late 1990s. In fact, that leads us to our fourth piece of evidence, the Tiberian Sun Manual, written by Raid
Stoysavljevic.
Now, since Tib Sun released in 1990, this puts us back to 3 years prior to the release of Renegade. On page 6 of the Tiberian Sun Manual, we are clearly told that the date is January 19th, 2030. And we know from the opening cutscene of Tiberian Sun that the game will end up starting on September 2nd, 2030. Under the heading Data Log of Past Conflict, there is a subheading, 20th Century Conflict. Here, we are told that the conflict between GDI and Nod originated in, quote, the late 20th century, unquote. This seems to put the events of the First Tiberian War firmly in the 20th century, necessarily in the late 1990s. All events of the interwar years are placed under the heading 21st century conflict. Although, interestingly, the mention of Kane's presumed death and the final battle against Nod is placed here too. Now, that may be just writing semantics, but there is enough here that you could make the argument that the First Tiberian War started in the 1990s, but spilled over into the early 2000s when it ended. I know many of my subscribers are fans of this theory, even if I still personally think that the war took place entirely in the 1990s. Oh, there's also this line about how GDI was, quote, formed 45 years ago by the final act of the United Nations Global Defense Initiative, unquote. Please ignore the repeated misspelling of defense and the weird grammatical structure of the sentence. The important thing here is that according to this math, GDI was founded in 1985. Now, this goes against what the Tiberian Dawn Manual said, which claimed that GDI was founded in 1995 by the United Nations Global Defense Act. It even goes beyond the year 1990, when GDI officially dropped the name Special Operations Group Echo Black Ops 9. The only explanation I can come up with is that either this is a mistake, or it's a fun little Easter egg to the year Westwood was founded, which was also in 1985. Anyway, it's up to you if these mistakes make the Tiberian Sun Manual less reliable in your eyes, but to me it just reinforces what the co-founders and producers of Westwood were already all saying in 1998, 1999, and 2000. The last piece of evidence is admittedly the weakest in my eyes, but I feel like I have to at least mention it. In Tiberium Wars, a game made by EALA at the time when most of the Westwood staff had already moved on, Kane mentions this in the GDI campaign.
Rejoice, children of Nod, the blood of your oppressors will flow, and 50 years of tyranny will finally end.
Okay, stop right there. 50 years of tyranny. Command & Conquer 3 takes place in 2047. 2047 minus 50 equals 1997. Huh. Well, that fits rather well. Almost too well. If it turns out that he's rounding rather than giving an exact number, we could also say that he's referring to 1995, when GDI itself was formed. I may be biased towards the 1990s camp, but I can admit that this piece of evidence could go either way. But here's what we're left with. I believe that at least by the year 2000, 2 years prior to the release of Renegade, and after the release of Tiberian Dawn, Red Alert 1, Soul Survivor, and Tiberian Sun, the internal vision of Westwood was that the First Tiberian War took place in the late 1990s. That, to me, is an indisputable fact. The only way that the 2020 date for the First Tiberian War can be canon then is if sometime in between 2000 and 2002, the powers that be at Westwood decided to retcon the date that they had run with for the first 5 years of the franchise history. And it would have to be a retcon. As the games were conceived and written at the time of their release, the First Tiberian War absolutely took place in the late 1990s. So that raises the question, what is the evidence pointing to said possible retcon? And here it is, folks. The piece of lore that is a monkey wrench stabbed into the back of this silverback gorilla, to mix my metaphors. The Command & Conquer Renegade Manual, written by Joseph Selinsky and Amy Ferris. On page 6 of the Renegade Game Manual, where it outlines the background of the First Tiberian War, in universe as a current ongoing war, there is an honest-to-goodness date written here, and it's the 12th of March, 2020. At first, I'll be honest, I thought this was just a typo that was missed by the developers. Maybe it was meant to be 2002 or a completely different date. But further down on the same page, the Ava data link lists the date for this message as 2020-3-12. The fact that this date is written twice and in a different format in each place, makes it far less likely to me that this was just a copy-pasted error. No, I don't think this was a typo. What I do think it is, however, is a big fat mistake. The next piece of evidence to the 2020 date is in the in-universe document known as Kane's Criminal Dossier. In the run-up to Command & Conquer 3 Tiberium Wars 2007 release, the EA website released this piece of lore as promotional material. According to the article on the EA website, Kane's Criminal Dossier was written on June 27, 2030, just before the Second Tiberium War. It was written by GDI InOps officer Leah Susskind, who ultimately defected to Nod at the onset of the Second Tiberium War. The purpose of this document is stated thusly, quote, "This dossier is the product of years of research on the myriad of myths surrounding Kane. Parts of this dossier have been withheld or blacked out by GDI intelligence," unquote. I encourage you to read it, as, although its canonicity is in question, what with it being lore outside of the game themselves and being made during the EALA era of the franchise, it has a lot of interesting lore implications for, if nothing else, EALA's vision of Kane's true nature. The key part we want to focus on for our purposes is that Kane is said to have, quote, "stealthily traveled the globe one step ahead of GDI, discreetly spreading his message of a Tiberium revolution from 1995 to 2019, unquote. Now, obviously 1995 is a key date as the year when Tiberium first arrived on Earth, so what's with the year 2019? And if Kane quote-unquote died at the end of the First Tiberian War in the late 1990s, then why does GDI apparently know that Kane was still alive afterwards? The first explanation I have to offer is the easiest one. If Renegade, which we know takes place towards the end of the First Tiberian War, takes place in 2020 as the manual states, then the war likely began a year or two earlier. After all, the final cutscene of the Tiberian Dawn GDI campaign clearly states that the First Tiberian War lasted 3 years. This portion of Kane's criminal dossier could very well be implying that EA believes that Kane was spreading his message of Tiberium from the moment it landed on Earth until near the start of the First Tiberian War, presumably in 2019. The other explanation relies on the fact that nowhere in this document is there any mention of Kane's death at all from the end of the First Tiberian War, nor is there any indication whatsoever that GDI believes Kane to be dead in 2030. Despite General Solomon's many public assurances that Kane is surely dead, it appears that GDI secretly knew otherwise. If that's the case, perhaps GDI was able to trace Kane's movements even post-death after the fact, but lost his trail sometime in 2019. I'll admit this is a bit of a stretch, and the first explanation is a bit more of an Occam's razor explanation. Moving to lore that actually occurs in the games, we now move to Tiberium Wars, the first Tiberium CNC made by EALA post-Westwood. In one of the earliest cutscenes in the GDI campaign, your commanding officer, General Jack Granger, impresses upon the player that Nod is still very much a threat, despite what the rest of GDI seems to believe. He states,
28 years of fighting out, there's one thing I can say with absolute certainty. As long as there's Tiberium on Earth, not as a serious threat.
Now, given that this game takes place in 2047, subtracting 28 years takes us to 2019. What a coincidence. Again, this may be an indicator that EALA took the Renegade data as fact and truly believes that the First Tiberium War began in 2019. Alternatively, Granger may not be referring to how long Nod has been at war with GDI, but simply be referring to his own personal history of fighting Nod as a GDI soldier. General Granger may simply be stating that he's been fighting Nod for 28 years. Michael Ironside, the legend who played General Granger, was 57 when Tiberium Wars released. Assuming he and the character he plays are similar ages, he would be about 29 years old when he joined GDI in the fight against Nod in Universe. That would make him a veteran of the Second Tiberium War and the Firestorm crisis against Cabal, as well as any interwar conflicts with the Brotherhood. All in all, I don't think this statement by itself is much of an indicator either way. Now, the biggest piece of evidence for the 2019 date outside of the Renegade Manual is undoubtedly the first cutscene for the Nod campaign of Tiberium Wars. Here, Nod commander and Inner Circle member Killian Qatar briefs the player on Nod's history. She says,
"The mainstream media branded us terrorists. But in 2019, we exposed GDI as the real terrorists and forced them to confess their heinous sins against humanity."
Now, I've gone over and over this piece of dialogue. Her wording leaves no room for ambiguity. Nod exposed GDI as quote-unquote the real terrorists in 2019, resulting in 2 world wars.
For our efforts, we were relentlessly attacked by GDI and their army of powermongers. The result was 2 pointless world wars that succeeded only in killing millions.
Resulting is a very specific choice of words. That means that it followed the exposure of GDI in 2019. EA clearly believes that the First Tiberian War did not occur until at least 2019. Now, the exposure of GDI as the real terrorists is an uncertain event. At first, I assumed this was referring to the Bialystok incident, where Nod framed GDI for an attack on a neutral village that kills many civilians, including children. But that happened during the First Tiberian War, as opposed to the First Tiberian War resulting from it. So, what is Killian talking about? Furthermore, some of Killian's information here is blatantly wrong, given what we know from Kane's own words in Tiberian Dawn. She claims here,
Long before the emergence of the green crystal on Earth in 1995, an event foreseen by our great leader, Kane. The existence of Tiberium was covered up for years by GDI. They call themselves the Global Defense Initiative, but they are actually a fascist political consortium of wealthy nations hell-bent on controlling the sacred green crystal. While GDI suppressed the truth about Tiberium, the Brotherhood worked tirelessly to acquire samples of the precious crystal, to study it, to unlock its potential as a new energy source.
So, according to Killian, GDI covered up the existence of Tiberium upon its arrival, and Nod struggled to get their hands on even a few samples of Tiberium. However, in Tiberian Dawn, Kane clearly states,
Tiberium is named after the Tiber River in Italy where it was first discovered.
Discovered by the Brotherhood, that is, and I named it after Tiberius Drusus Caesar.
So Kane says that Nod was the first to discover Tiberium in the Tiber River in Italy where it landed. Nod clearly would then have access to samples of Tiberium before any GDI member states had a chance to cover it up. Now, in-universe, it's possible that Killian is simply spouting a revisionist history to a Nod commander that was born after the Tiberian apocalypse, who wouldn't be able to fact-check any of this anyway. I mean, her version of events unequivocally paint Nod in the best possible light, so that kinda tracks. Out of universe, EALA may simply have not done their research well enough, leading to these lore mistakes. Okay, so what evidence do we have, in summary, for the 2019 date? We have the Renegade Manual's date, which is, in my opinion, the best piece of evidence for this camp. It's Westwood, it's a clear date, and it's written twice in 2 different date formats, lessening the odds of it being a typo. Then we have Kane's criminal dossier, which points towards a 2019 date, but not definitively. Also, it was written during the EALA era, not Westwood, and it's lore material outside the games. Next, we have General Granger's comment in CNC3 about fighting Nod for 28 years, pointing again towards the year 2019, but again, this is not definitive, and could simply be referring to Granger's personal history of fighting Nod. Finally, we have Killian Qatar's comments about Nod's history, also in CNC3. This is probably the most definitive in-game reference to 2019 being the start of the First Tiberian War, and if nothing else, it proves that EALA, at least, believes this to be the proper year. However, as we've seen, Killian's monologue has other lore errors in it, casting her entire version of events into doubt. And of course, this is EALA, not Westwood. So if it is evidence for a 2019 First Tiberian War, on its own, it's only evidence of a retcon, not original intent. And a retcon by EALA at that.
That has a tendency to disrupt carbon-based molecular structures with inconsequent and unequal positrons orbiting on the first, second, and ninth quark rings. Whoa, is that good or bad? Let me put it this way, Eddie.
So, there's the evidence. I encourage you to go through all the links I have in the description of this video of the primary sources and come to your own conclusions. But if you want this Snowman's take, I think the First Tiberian War definitely took place in the late 1990s. Me personally would place it specifically starting in 1997 and ending in 1999. I think all developer interviews and all Westwood material in the games outside of the Renegade Manual point towards a late 1990s date. I think it's silly to take two dates in one manual as enough weight of evidence to erase all the other evidence to the contrary that came before. I also think that EALA believes the First Tiberian War did take place in 2019, probably based on that Renegade Manual date. And even from an in-universe lore/story perspective, I think it makes so much more sense that we have about 30 years in between the events of Tiberian Dawn and Tiberian Sun. Some people think we need about 20 years for Tiberium to spread to the extent we see in Tiberian Dawn, but I respectfully disagree. It's an alien crystal. It can spread far faster than any analogs we have in Earth plant life. And the extent of Tiberium spread we see in Tiberian Dawn is not as extensive as what we see in Tiberian Sun by a long shot. So, which one needs a bigger time gap in-universe, really? Look, I could go on and on about why the 2019 date doesn't make sense time-wise in-universe, but I think my subscribers have said it better than I ever could, so I'll let them take over from here. I prefer the earlier date because it gives more time for the setting of Tiberian Sun to develop, and for the world as we know to fade away. I feel like if Tiberian Dawn and Tiberian Sun were only 10 years apart, there'd be a lot more cultural inertia from the old world, and Nod's position would be far more precarious, as not only are they rebuilding from decisively losing the First Tiberian War, but also building their state outright, when they aren't really a pre-existing culture in the regions they're claiming. Mutants would also be a lot newer, and they seem to have come together into their own culture instead of being people who are just surviving, and for stereotypes to develop in turn. And you'd think GDI would still be dealing with national remnants when it deploys. The later start date also makes it seem like no one was actually studying the side effects of Tiberium for almost 3 decades, when the secondary plot of Tiberian Dawn was very much that people are waking up to just how horrifying Tiberium is, even though at this stage, Tiberium hasn't spread that far. It's widespread, but not densely so, if that makes sense. Giving more time for various firebreak attempts to be tried and failed. The idea that you need almost 3 decades to get to the Tiberian Dawn stage, but then only 10 years to get to the Tiberian Sun stage just feels backwards to me. I do very much prefer the concept that it takes place in the 90s. It also allows it to exist in that space of time in an arms race accelerated by Tiberium. There's also not enough of a gap to explain the events in Tiberian Sun. Technological advancement tends to branch outwards and snowball. A breakthrough in engine output leads to 3 separate other advancements, and so on. Tiberium would have been the mother of all technological catalysts, and indeed, just a few decades later, we have walkers, spaceships, orbital drop pods, and cyborgs. As the First Tiberian War rolls out, our technology is still familiar and concurrent with the late 90s. Sure, we've got massive 2-barrel juggernauts and death laser obelisks, but Cold War era vehicles, i.e. the M113 APC and Humvee, are still considered the height of military gear in spite of the massive tech boom that Tiberium unlocked. While we have aspects of future tech and such in Tib Dawn, I think that the change of timeline following Red Alert 1, as stated in the GDI history vid, makes sense we have such going on in the 90s. It's an artifact of the time it was made, sure, but the feeling of Tib Dawn just fits the 90s/2000s far better than 2019. So, mostly vibes, I know. I like the idea of 2019, but logically it must be late 90s for such a drastic change to the Earth. Having it go from 30 years up to barely beneath 10, First War was a 3-year conflict, up to Tiberian Sun with all the tech and infrastructure that was established to exist in Tiberian Sun, such as Nod's underground tunnel network, Cabal network, mass-produced cyborgs compared to Renegade, Philadelphia, drop ships, and walkers is very schizophrenic. I don't think I can say that.
And I want to make jokes, and if I make a joke, I want you to think about what the joke actually means instead of getting scared of the words.
Sanctioned by the United Nations, the Global Defense Initiative has one goal: Eliminate multinational terrorism in an effort to preserve freedom.
Look, I'll be honest. This particular Snowman is probably taking this lore issue far too seriously. It really doesn't matter. If you still think that the First Tiberian War took place around 2020, more power to you. Is what a rational person would say. But I am a very irrational snowman. This is one of the 4 hills I will die on. In case you're curious, the other 3 are: 1. The Chronicles of Narnia should be read in original publication order, not internal chronological order, as set out by HarperCollins. Screw you, HarperCollins. Number 2. The Red Alert 1 Soviet ending cannot result in the Tiberium timeline as seen in Tiberium Dawn, seen by History of Nod Part 2 video. Number 3. Minecraft Phantoms are stupid and ruin the intended progression of the game, where staying up through the nights is a sign of becoming stronger, and being forced to skip the nights from time to time fundamentally misunderstands the point of the entire game. But the bottom line is, if you put a gun to my Xbox and a gun to my PC, I firmly believe that the First Tiberian War takes place in the late 1990s. I think that that was the intention of all the story guys in Westwood, including the co-founders and heads of Westwood, which, by the way, includes the executive producer of Renegade. I think that there is a very brief 2-year window whereupon Westwood could have made a retcon, but I find it extremely unlikely that that would have occurred. I think that the Renegade Manual 2020 date is a mistake, not a typo, but a miscommunication between teams during a very hectic time of development of several concurrent Westwood products. And I think that even if there was a Westwood retcon, I think that that would be a bad retcon, as it makes very little sense given what was presented in the previous games and game manuals. I'm also now convinced that EALA took that 2020 Renegade date as canon for Tiberium Wars. All in all, I think that there is far more evidence for a late 1990s First Tiberium War than there is for a 2019 First Tiberium War. And as a final note, I really wish that I could get concrete confirmation from the former Westwood higher-up on the date of the First Tiberian War, so that this debate can be put to bed forever, if nothing else in my own mind, one way or another. I may never grow larger than about 3,000 subscribers, but if I ever do grow enough to become a more prominent CNC channel on YouTube, my only aspiration right now is to grow big enough to get a direct answer on this question from a former Westwood developer. This is my white whale. I did try to reach out to some old Westwood devs for this video, but my efforts came up empty. If that ever changes, I'll make an update and link to it from this video. There. Now that that's out of the way, I can finally begin work on the biggest project I've ever set my sights on for this channel. A comprehensive history of the First Tiberian War. And lucky for you guys, I'm going to need your help.